Okay. It is noon on the dot in New York. Welcome to everyone. Jeffrey Bernard, as always, front and center from the Upper West Side. Elliot, good to see you again from Olympia, Washington. And where everybody else is coming from, I'm going to drop the chat now so we can get started pretty much on the dot because there's a lot to cover. For those of you who joined us yesterday, I alluded to the fact that when I put this together, based on an actual walking tour that I have done. I hit the, I got to about 110 slides and I said, oh boy, we better do this as a two-parter. So this is going to be part one. And I'll be specific as to what we're covering today in part one. And then in January, we'll do part two because Williamsburg is definitely a force to be reckoned with as a neighborhood. And one of the things I like to say about Williamsburg to people who don't know much about it is, and I'm sure there are a lot of people on this talk today who do know a lot about it, that it is unlike any other neighborhood in the world, it's unique because it took three very disparate things and brought them together for better or for worse. It starts out as an industrial center, and then it becomes an artist enclave. It becomes a cultural center. And then it just sort of dives headlong into unabashed residential commercialism, which is kind of what we're dealing with now in Williamsburg. And it made them all live together, under the shadow of a great bridge, which we'll also talk a little bit about. And so this tour is going to examine the layers of Williamsburg, some noticed, some unnoticed, but all that come together to make this synthesis of industry, art, grit, and hip, which really made Brooklyn as a whole sort of a worldwide branding phenomena in the past 15 or so years. And it starts in Williamsburg. So the best example that I have of it is actually the hotel where the tour started. Now, the reason why it started at this hotel, this is the Wythe Hotel on North 11th and Wythe Avenue on the north side of the neighborhood. This tour today will consist of the north side and mainly Kent to Bedford avenues, which are considered to be what I guess you would call waterfront. So waterfront north side of Williamsburg. We have so much to talk about. I can only do that. And then when we do a part two, if you guys want to see a part two after this, we'll do south and east sides of Williamsburg. And we've only covered half of the walking tour. If any of you have joined me on my in-person walking tours, I like to cover a lot of ground and usually about 2 hours. Well, this tour was commissioned by the owner of the Wythe Hotel. He commissioned Untapped, we were cities at the time, to do a hotel for his guests, to let the guests understand the neighborhood that the hotel was in. And I took the challenge gladly and spent a couple of months developing and researching it. I learned a lot myself. Now, this hotel was opened in 2012. Now, before that, this building was a cooperage. And for those of you who don't know what cooperages are, they make barrels. Very, very lucrative business in North Williamsburg because the biggest industries in Williamsburg at the time this cooperage, this particular building was built in 1901. We had sugar refining going on a couple of blocks down at Domino, which we'll talk about. And we had about 50 breweries brewing beer. Williamsburg was a big brewing center. We are not going to talk about the brewing industry in this tour. That could be a tour within itself. I will include it in part two when we are done. We are going to talk about sugar refining at length, actually, because it really is sort of one of the industries that makes Williamsburg. Now, this hotel is owned by a man named Peter Lawrence, who sort of went into partnership with Two Trees, which is going to be a development company we will talk about at length during this tour as well. And the architect Morris Ajmi, I hope I'm saying his last name right, was brought in 2012 to redo this space, and he does a really nice job. But let's talk a little bit first about the history of the space, and this is actually a picture of the hotel in the early 1990s, before gentrification hits Williamsburg. And at this point, it is not a cooperage. It was a cooperage from 1901 for the Weidman family. Very important to know that most of the main players in the late 19th and early 20th century are going to be German, especially in this area. German immigrants really build the industry around Williamsburg at the time. And in 1893, Paul Weidman and his sons build their first cooperage, which burns to the ground in 1900. Theobald Engelhardt, who is probably not a name a lot of people know, but he was a very popular industrial architect. He did almost 300 buildings in Williamsburg all around, and he designs this building for the Weidmans. He builds it in almost a little less than a year, and here it is in the 90s. At this point, it's a textile factory. And from the late 50s into the 80s, it was manufacturing textile fabric covers for speakers, audio speakers, which obviously went out of vogue after the 90s. So this is a shot of it as that textile company. This is a block and lot photo from 1940, and you'll see that spiral staircase running up sort of the center rib of the building. And that was there back from when it was a cooperage. There was at one point, Peter Lawrence, the owner, was telling me that they would roll barrels down chutes from the top of the building all the way down to the street to load them onto trucks to deliver them to the brewers and the sugar refineries in the area. And then this stair gave quicker access to workers. You could actually see there's somebody on it right there. I also increased the size of my cursor. I hope it's easier to see. In black and whites, it still gets a little lost, but it's much bigger than it used to be because I do a lot of pointing, I know. And that was some feedback I got. So this actually gave workers easier access to go up and down the different levels of the building than going into inside staircases because it was so densely packed with machinery. Now, this is a photo that Peter Lawrence gave to me of the space when he found it. Basically, at the time in the early aughts, he was trying to find a space to do a hotel. Williamsburg was just coming online as, again, this new hip destination, a global destination, still is. Well, pandemic notwithstanding. And this was a photo of the outside. Obviously, you could see graffiti. We will talk about street art during this tour as well. Here's an interior shot. This was the fabric company had downsized quite a bit in the space at this point. We're not using a large percentage of the space, only sort of corners of it. You could see that here. But take note of the wooden floors. Those floors were original. And actually, Morris Ajmi will incorporate the floors into what the hotel rooms look like today. You'll see in the ceiling. Those are original floors. And Ajmi decided that one of his things, we're going to see his work again in a couple of buildings in Williamsburg. He wanted to leave as many of the historical accents as possible to really create what is a phenomenal building. I have been in it. I was given many tours of different rooms and different spaces of the hotel as I was putting together the tour. And it really is a really great space. This is the restaurant downstairs, right off of the lobby. I've had a couple of meals there post-tour. So what I would do is I'd actually meet the guests right here in the lobby at those this right table here with those little stools in the front. And before I talk about what I start the tour with, I want you to notice in the ceiling, there's this rail that's running. And that was, again, left as an homage to the cooperage. That was part of sort of a conveyor belt that would roll finished barrels out of the building, all throughout the levels and then out of the building. I thought that was a really nice touch. But I would meet tour goers here, and then I would immediately talk about this illustration that's hanging on the wall on the right side. And I'm going to show you a full picture of it. It's not framed in the full picture, but it's done by an artist by the name of Duke Riley. Now, what you have to understand about the Wythe is that the Wythe considers itself to be an incubator space for local artists. Duke Riley is now a fairly big name. I don't even think he lives in Williamsburg anymore, but at the time, he had started to do a lot of his work in Williamsburg. He's actually from Massachusetts, and he came down. He was obsessed with urban shoreline and how urban nature sort of plays against waterways. And so Williamsburg was a great place for him to start. He also started as a tattoo artist, which you're going to see in this painting here. Oh, but no, you're not. Give me a minute. I'm still doing background on Duke. So Duke actually was well known. He was in the news. You may remember this back from 2007. He had constructed a scale replica of the Revolutionary War era submarine, the Turtle, which George Washington had commissioned to sort of use as espionage against the British fleet in the harbor of New York. And it was designed by David Bushnell. And it didn't work very well for the troops back then, but he redesigns it and he actually makes it usable. It fits two people. He goes and he brings Jesse Bushnell, who was a direct descendant of David Bushnell, as the Queen Mary is coming into the harbor. And he leaves from Williamsburg, by the way, and he gets arrested because he was not authorized to do this. And they said that he was putting both the Queen Mary and himself in danger. But it was sort of an homage to the espionage of the Americans against the British as the Queen Mary too is pulling in from England. And it gave him a little bit of notoriety. Now, here is the painting. I'm sorry, the illustration. It is not a painting. There's a lot going on here. And this is a whole allegory of the history of the Williamsburg waterfront. And you can see there are numbers. Those numbers are not on the actual illustration. This is done for a piece Duke Riley did as a key to what's going on. Now you can see he's a tattoo artist. He does a very old school style nautical tattoo look to all of this, like the sailors used to get. And I'm going to point out a couple of the things going on here. There's 42 points of interest. We're not going to go through all 42. We'll be here for a while, but as always, I can send a link to this picture and the key that Duke put together. And actually he put pamphlets and put them in the hallway of the Wythe so people could take a look at what he was trying to get across here. The whole thing is called The Tree That Man Cut Down, which actually comes from Betty Smith's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Very, very famous book about growing up in Williamsburg as a poor Irish immigrant. And if you look at number 7, you'll see there are beaver hanging on a rope with nautical flags. And the nautical flags actually spell out the tree that man cut down across the entire width of all of this. In the center between the flags, that is actually the Wythe Hotel burning. It was the Newcastle Fabric Company before it was the Wythe, and that is the allusion to the fire that took out the original Wideman cooperage as well. But you'll notice there are a ton of beaver. Actually, beaver are really the main drivers of the action in this illustration. And Duke did that because A, it's an homage to the really beginning of European Williamsburg, which was settled by the Dutch in 1638, again, as another place to engage in fur trade, like New Amsterdam. But also Duke had said that beaver, like humans, are the only animals on the planet that willfully destroy their environment or alter their environment for their own purposes. And I guess that is a much wider comment on what humans do. And you can see there are actually beaver doing dams over on the water. And the other thing that I like to point out is Bayside Petro. And we're going to talk about the Bayside Oil Company because they are at the foot of Bushwick Inlet. But there's a lot going on here. We could spend a half hour talking about this. Duke Riley's other big piece from the Navy Yard back in, I believe it was 2016, Duke Riley teamed up with Creative Time to do Fly By Night. Duke Riley is also obsessed with pigeons, which you will see quite a few of in that illustration as well. And he did, from May to July, he would tag pigeons with these sort of lasers and then set them up at night. And these were the sort of flying patterns that would go up against the sky from the Navy Yard. So he really liked to interplay between the coast and his art, and Williamsburg was a really fertile ground for him. As I began to say, the Wythe considers itself to be an incubator for local artists. All of the rooms have original art from locally based artists. And we're going to come back at the end of the tour where we'll end with the sign, the hotel sign, which is a conglomerate of 2 artists. But obviously art is very central to the Williamsburg we knew, and still to the Williamsburg we know right now. But I want to talk about this space, which is down the street from the hotel, also on North 11th. It's the Hecla Ironworks. Building is still there. The offices, which is where my cursor is, or actually it's a landmark building, and I'll show you why in a minute. But you may not have heard of the Hecla Iron Works, but they definitely have contributed a lot of cast iron ornamentation to some of New York's most famous structures. Hecla is named after Mount Hecla, which is still an active volcano in Ireland, which was fitting because its two founders were Scandinavian, although not Icelandic, by the way. Danish-born Niels Paulsen, and he had a Norwegian partner, Charles Eger, both of which came at separate points to New York and started in the cast iron business when they got here at the height of sort of cast iron building. But by the mid 1880s, cast iron is going out of fashion. Now, for those of you who don't know exactly what I'm talking about, think Soho. A lot of buildings, large clumps of buildings in Soho are cast iron facades. The reason why not only was it decorative, but also it was considered at the time to be fireproof, although it really isn't, or it wasn't in that form. But Iger and Paulsen get together and form their own company, which they call Iger and Paulsen for a while, but then change it to Hecla to give it sort of a flashier name. And they get into iron ornamentals. And that was big business for them. Here's an 1898 ad for the Hecla Iron Works, as you can see, formerly Paulsen and Eger. And what they did was they employed a type of patented cast iron that used, you'll see it at the bottom there. It says Bauer and Barf, not as in barfing, but as in a name, B-A-R-F-F, where the Bauer and Barf method was to highly pressurize, using pressurized high temperature steam against the cast iron to give it a very nice velvety black patina, much like you have on your cast iron skillets that we use in cooking today. And it gave it a very, very unique look. And it was guaranteed to stay black and shiny for 100 years, at least. And this is inside the offices and showroom of the Hecla building on North 11th. You see those gorgeous vaulted ceilings. No, they're not Guastavinos, obviously, but they are. I am a sucker for a vaulted ceiling, for those of you who know me. And these are the showrooms for what the Hecla company could do. Now, there is a piece here that you may recognize from a very famous New York structure. I'm not sure if anybody wants to take a guess, but you can take a minute. There's a piece here, and if you want to take a guess and know where it's from, I will actually go up to look at the chat for a second, just in case anybody's got it. All right. You may or may not kick yourself. It's not that obvious, though. Oh, wait, got some. Hold on. Ah, Robin, I knew, you know what, Robin? I knew if you were on it, I knew you were going to get it. Yes. So the centerpiece in the front where my cursor is the iron ornamental fence for the Dakota. Good job, Robin. And I'll show you a picture of it in a second. Here's a picture of the draftsmen and creators and craftsmen of the Hecla Iron Company in their office. And as you could see, for the late 1800s, this is a very bright, very open and airy space to do work. And the Hecla Company was rumored to be a great place to work. They were very good to their employees, and this was a beautiful space. And there it is. There is at the corner of the Dakota, the Hecla iron fence. This was actually added on a little bit later after the Dakota opened. It was not there originally. I think about 10 years later. But of course, my favorite, because transit nerd here, as you well know, the Hecla Company did all 133 of the original Interborough Rapid Transit subway kiosks. And these were modeled after the Budapest kiosks. And this is actually the City Hall Station kiosk itself. And all of them, save for a couple, were ripped up in 1940 during the unification of all three lines. If you want to see two originals that are still Hecla original from 1908, Wall Street 4 and 5 outside of Trinity. They're not full kiosks, they're actually kiosk hoods, but those are Hecla. You know why? Because they have the Hecla branding on the bottom, which again, where my cursor is, you can kind of see it here, but there it is. A lot of people think Astor Place's kiosk is an original. It is not. It was put in the early 80s. And here's the Hecla showroom and office today. It's now actually a shared office co-working space. And you can see this building is now 120 something years old, and that patina now has turned to rust. But the reason why I love the building so much is that it's very unique for where it is. It's just a unique looking cast iron building, and it stands out. It is landmarked as well. Really, really great spot. So I do bring everybody there. And here is the inside, actually, right before they were renovating it to turn it into co-working space. But you can see, again, these two banks of windows and these great ceilings make it a very nice looking place to work. And right across the street is Brooklyn Brewery. And Brooklyn Brewery has a large part of the remaining Hecla campus where they store beer and all of the goods that go to brewing Brooklyn beer, although most of the brewing process is now outside of Williamsburg. And again, we'll talk about brewing part 2. So a defining feature of the shoreline of Williamsburg, which begins its industrial might, is the Bushwick Inlet. This map is from the late 1800s. And what you see is the Bushwick Inlet, for those of you who know the geography of the space, sort of turns itself into the neighborhood at about North 14th Street today. Now you see here, it's got North 14th and 15th. And actually where the inlet sort of spreads its fingers out and becomes little tributaries, right around here, where my cursor is circling, is where McCarran Park is going to be. And there are also rumors that a little bit of the Bushwick Inlet still kind of runs under McCarran Park. But I want to talk about this area here where it says K and Culver. That's going to be the beginning of the industry that will take over this shoreline. And technically that's Greenpoint, but the power of the tidal forces that push Bushwick Inlet inland from the East River made it a great place to set up water wheels for early industry. And one of the first companies that capitalizes on this is the Continental Iron Works. And the Continental Iron Works finds itself in the late 1850s on the shores of the Bushwick Inlet. And they are famous for building the Union's first ironclad battleship, the USS Monitor. And it was launched from that spot at K Street in 1862 to enter service. It only had less than 2 years of service before it was unfortunately sunk, but it was the industry standard for ironclad vessels at the time because of that revolving turret. And it did actually battle a ship called the CSS, a Confederate ship, Virginia, which was built over the hull of the old Merrimack, which I believe we all know about the Merrimack. That's the one we learn about in history class. But Greenpoint itself is actually very proud of this history, and for many years has planned to do a little museum to the Monitor and the Continental Iron Works, which we'll actually talk about in a second when we talk about Bushwick Inlet Park, the promised park we still don't have. But right across the inlet was this facility, which was Astral Oil. And Astral Oil was started by a New England native by the name of Charles Pratt. Now you may recognize that name because of Pratt Institute. And yes, Pratt began making his money in whale oil up in Massachusetts, and then started refining on this site kerosene, which made him a lot of money. And then he gets into business with Charles Ellis and Henry Rogers, who were from Western Pennsylvania, and they started finding petroleum oil and drilling for it. And he was refining petroleum oil and, of course, making quite a lot of money off of that. So much so that John D. Rockefeller in 1874 absorbs Astral Oil into Standard Oil, which, again, we all know because Standard Oil was in business for many years before it was broken up. And with the money that Pratt makes off of oil refining on the spot at Bushwick Inlet, he founds Pratt Institute. And Pratt Institute, which I always think is sort of, you know, a nice little hand-in-hand homage. Pratt Institute, of course, educates, currently even, a lot of artistic students and artists who would then infiltrate Williamsburg in the late 80s and 90s and turn it into an artist's haven looking for cheap rent. So again, this is where the turn sort of begins from industry leading its way into the artistic neighborhood that Williamsburg is so closely going to be associated with, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. And today it is the abandoned site of Bayside Oil, and the drums are still there. And it is the much debated site for Bushwick Inlet Park. Bayside Oil moved out of this facility years ago and sold it to city storage, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the tanks are still there. And again, it's Bushwick Inlet in this area by North 14th in the water is called the last industrial wilderness in Williamsburg, and soon to be wiped off the face of Williamsburg. But let's talk, this is hard to encapsulate in a slide. So I got this really nice illustration that shows really where the fulcrum of Williamsburg turns. And this is the what started as a Giuliani era initiative to rezone the waterfront of Greenpoint in Williamsburg, which was carried headlong by Bloomberg into the 2005 rezoning that completely changed the neighborhood of Williamsburg as we know it. There are 95 different instances of rezoning represented here artfully on this map, but what's really important to see is the yellow on the water line, which turns what was industrial to residential. And that becomes important because it lets developers develop the water line, the shoreline, which a lot of people in the neighborhood were very heartily against because they knew it would drive rents and property values up, thus driving rents up for people who didn't own, good for people who owned. But also the idea was, oh no, we're going to get these towers on the water line, which are going to block our views and all that stuff. Now, you'll notice here, this green, thick green square, that's Bushwick Inlet Park. When the zoning went through, they said to all of the residents, yes, we're going to rezone, but we're going to give you this great 15-acre park. We're really going to start to redevelop the water line so that the public gets access to a space that they haven't had access to in over 150 years, which is the water line. And a lot of people were not, they didn't buy it. And they didn't like the idea anyway. But Bloomberg himself had said, basically industry doesn't live in New York anymore. It's moved on, it's gone to other places. It goes to Long Island, it goes to Westchester, it goes to Jersey, it goes to the Midwest. New York isn't a home to industry anymore. As a matter of fact, his direct quote in 2003 Financial Times was, if you're a pharmaceutical company or a steel company, you don't need to be here. New York should not be wasting its time with manufacturing. And he actually regrets that, saying that later on, because a lot of the industrial revenue and jobs that New York was still holding at the time will leave, and that will negatively impact New York's bottom line. But the residential fallout was, I guess, quite better, because what it becomes, as the New York Times said, especially the waterfront in Williamsburg, quote, a high-end product, maybe even a luxury product, and it's both. And Two Trees is one of those companies that comes in. I've actually done some work for Two Trees, so we'll talk about that in a second. But be prepared. The next image is a resident who was not happy, and he puts his finger up along the towers that this was one of Two Trees' first developments of the waterfront that hit a little later on in, I think, 2010, 2011. I'm not exactly sure the original date of that. And the idea was, well, you're going to do it anyway, but we don't like it. And a lot of residents did not. But it keeps going anyway. And again, the promise was we were going to get from Bushwick Inlet, which is this nub right here. That's the old inlet. And actually this spot right here is where the monitor was launched, where my cursor is. And there's Bayside, the remnants of Bayside Oil, where Astral Oil was. They were going to buy this entire swath of land and turn it into a great public park for everyone to enjoy. The problem was the owner of the park was asking a very high price for it. And that has delayed the park even to this day. And if you go to the spot where it is, it looks like this still. And there's fencing along Kent right here. And somebody had crocheted a sign for the park there, basically saying, "Where is our park?" And it was announced in 2016 by de Blasio that they had actually worked out a deal with the owner of the space, and they were going to. He wanted 325 million, but they settled on 160. The city was only going to give 100. No, I'm sorry, 165. The city was only going to give 160, but they brought it up. He said, "Okay, great," and there it is. By the way, his name is Norm Brodsky, and it's a city. He's the owner of City Storage. He settled for 160 million, but the site is still not developed. This is a panorama of what the Bushwick Inlet looks like. And again, this is the beginning, the remnant of the beginning of the industrial Williamsburg. And this was a recent rendering that came out. So the city's plan was to develop 1.9 acres of the site. And I'll show you exactly which 1.9 in a second. And this was announced last December. Here's a rendering. And again, it's this red dotted line. So a very small part of the entire park is going to go into development. When the rest of it is not sure, because it's going to require a lot more money and manpower. What we do have is East River Park right here. One of the things that they want to do with this park is create a beach, and beaches have become a priority. East River Park has a beach as well. Beaches have become a priority because they are seen as a way to mitigate flooding during storm surges. So they want to put a beach there, and also you see Monitor boat launch, which will be a memorial to the launch of the Monitor. Now, for those of you who remember Williamsburg in the 90s, my first forays into Williamsburg were 97, I believe, and it still pretty much looked like this around 1997. This is the corner of Kent and Metropolitan. This building right here, I'm going to talk about. It's a really stunning building. It is a Cass Gilbert. A lot of people did not know that. It was one of the only anchors of this immediate area. But just to show you the impact of the rezoning, 1991 today. This is the same exact view. I took this from Google Maps, and you can see Williamsburg is practically a different neighborhood from what it was, again, 91 to today. And construction still continues. Almost on every corner, you will find buildings going up. Construction very much happening. But let's go back to that Cass Gilbert. Really fascinating building. It was the Austin Nichols main production and warehouse center, and Austin Nichols was a grocer, a nationwide grocer brand, and a liquor concern, and also a very forward-thinking company, much like Hecla, a great place to work. And they wanted to build a facility that would show their might, but also their humanistic side. So this place, they get Cass Gilbert fresh off of doing the Woolworth building to design it, and he does it in an Egyptian Renaissance style. It utilizes very ingeniously not only the waterfront where boats could come in to drop off goods, but also the network of train tracks which existed in this area until the early 80s, which were carrying goods in and out of the neighborhood. But when this was completed, and also, by the way, Sunbeam, as you can see backward in the sign, Sunbeam was their largest national grocery brand. And this building was very forward thinking. It had cold storage, vacuum cleaners, and laundry machines, which were very much ahead of its time for when it opened in 1915. It also used electric vehicles to move around the facility. They had electric trucks which plugged into battery packs to charge them. Again, very forward thinking. But what's even greater about it were the amenities that they built into the building, which were 3 recreational fields on the roof where you could play football, you could play soccer. There was a hospital, so if workers got hurt, they could be attended to immediately on site. And there were 2 restaurants in this facility. and one restaurant for more executive types, and then a restaurant for the workers themselves. So this was a really fascinating spot. Now, I learned a lot about it. Developing the tour, I saw the building, and the building, even amongst all the new high-rises that are going up, sticks out. It's really an architectural beauty. Again, it really shows Cass Gilbert's range in being an architect, but it's also just so unique. But what a lot of people don't realize is this building was very much in danger. It was abandoned for a while. They tried to split it up to rent out different cargo areas to store stuff, but it wasn't really going. And in 2005, landmarks came together to figure out what to do with this building. And there was a large group of people, including the mayor himself, Mayor Bloomberg, who wanted to landmark the building. And there were quite a few people from the neighborhood council who did not. They wanted it wiped off the face of the neighborhood to get ready for Bloomberg's rezoning. They thought, well, let's just build on top of this thing because it's an eyesore to the neighborhood. And actually, this is what it looked like as they were repainting it. But what happened was landmarks actually voted to landmark it. But it was so contentious. So here are some of the quotes that were going on during the meeting. Simke Felder, who was on the New York City Council Subcommittee on Landmarks for Public Siting and Maritime Uses, said the building is a piece of trash and it should be knocked down. Bloomberg himself said preserving this site is important for the fabric of our community. He liked it. This was an unusual move for Bloomberg. Another city council member said, I cannot distinguish this warehouse from dozens of other warehouses and factory buildings on the waterfront. It just simply doesn't deserve it, meaning a landmark status. It's a nondescript white box of a building. And who had the last word? Who always has the last word and sums it up perfectly, is Ada Louise Huxtable said, of course it should be landmarked. It's by Cass Gilbert. It's one of our great architects. You people who have absolutely know nothing about making outrageous statements about the architectural value of the building, meaning all the people who said it's trash and it's a white box have no idea what they're talking about. And the landmark was voted to be put on it, and 2 months later, historically reversed. They had just decided that it was not unanimous enough to keep it on, and they decided to reverse the landmarking. But the developer who took it over actually applied for a lien of easement from the Trust of Architectural Easements, which meant that he was getting some really great tax benefits in keeping the building as it is as an exterior and not adding to the height and not altering the exterior, but he had sway to gut the whole thing and do what he wanted with it inside. And he gets the tax breaks, but it's technically not an official city landmark, but you could see it's on the National Register of Historic Places. And who gets brought in to redesign it, but Morris Ashby, the same architect who was doing the Wythe, and he does a really splendid job. I got inside this building. Actually, the way I learned about this building, a guest on my Penn tour lives in the building and became historically obsessed with it and wanted to sort of give it a same treatment that I was giving Penn. He started a website about it. I connected him with the Historical Society to go in to look at Cass Gilbert's blueprints about it. And he loved living here. He loved the building, and it's really quite well done. Again, Ashby left a lot of the historical accents by adding in a lot of common spaces as well. This is a common space. This is the courtyard, a common courtyard that is accessible to all of the residents. And this is what a corner apartment looks like. And the building really looks great. They repainted it. It's beautifully white. It really shows off its Egyptian Renaissance style that Cass Gilbert used. And it's dwarfed in the neighborhood now. It's a huge building, but it's very much dwarfed by all the other development that's going on. But it really is an architectural gem amidst all of the new development that's been going on. So as you see here, there is the Austin Nichols building, but I'm showing you this spot here at Metropolitan and River, right on the water. And you might be saying, Justin, why are we looking at an abandoned field? Well, my friends, this is where Williamsburg began. The original Williamsburg settlement happens on these few acres right here on the river. And we'll talk about that in a second, because there was a ferry that used to come into what was known as the Bushwick Road, not Metropolitan, then becomes the highway to Jamaica, which then later on becomes Metropolitan. So let's talk a little bit about the developmental history of Williamsburg from back in the day. Here is a map from pre-Williamsburg, Williamsburg. So the Dutch buy this area from the Canarsie, actually rumored to be the same tribe that sold the Dutch Manhattan, the Canarsie tribe, but they sold it for a higher price than they did for Manhattan, which historians love to say is a harbinger for things to come, because obviously for a while, probably even still today, Williamsburg real estate is valued a little higher, at least rental-wise, than Manhattan. But it was a fur trading post, and then the French take it over for a while. Then Peter Stuyvesant, 6th Director General, buys a very large swath of land in this area and calls the whole area Boswick, which translates in Dutch Point of Woods, and is obviously then Anglicanized into the name Bushwick. So Williamsburg is actually a sub-neighborhood of Bushwick for many years, until a ferry operator by the name of Richard Woodhull decides he wants to start, get this, a high-end real estate prospect on the banks of the East River because of its proximity to Lower Manhattan. Sound familiar? And because he himself are operating Lower Manhattan ferries to Brooklyn, he thinks, I'm going to make a mint off of this. But what kind of boats is he running in the year is 1792? Love this. He's running these things called team boats. And team boats are ferries that, this is, we're talking 15 years out of Robert Fulton's steam engine. You've got 2 horsepower, literally driven by 2 horses. And you'll see here at this diagram, the 2 horses on the side are actually turning a larger wheel, which is then in turn turning the side wheels, which are bringing the ferry from Corlear's Hook, where this service began, over to the foot of what is Metropolitan Avenue, right there. So what Richard Woodhull does, and by the way, not to be confused with, for those of you who know, Richard Woodhull, who is the start of the Culper Spy Ring. Same family, different person. Richard Woodhull decides to develop 13 acres keep going back here, at this spot to build high-end, lovely homes overlooking the river. He builds a pub or a tavern to start everything going. And who does he get to survey this land for him? None other than this guy, whose name is Jonathan Williams. Now, those of you, again, who know history very well may know that Jonathan Williams is also the gentleman who will survey West Point, considered to be the father of West Point up the river. Also Governor's Island, he helps to fortify the harbor and the rivers before the War of 1812. He's also the grandnephew of Benjamin Franklin. And we have Castle Williams, as some of you who know who's joined Mandy on her Governor's Island tour, is named after him. And Williamsburg is named after him. And that's why it's called Williamsburg for this guy right here. The problem is this 13-acre prospect by Woodhull will fail. He will hit financial ruin in 1811, and the site will go fairly undeveloped. But there's another father of Williamsburg, who we'll talk about in a second, who is more successful. But what I'd like you to notice here in this view of Williamsburg, Long Island from New York is look at the homes right around that spot that I was showing you. These are not what we associate with Williamsburg homes. They're nicer, freestanding, larger homes that are enjoying the sort of start of a bedroom community, which is connected, much like Brooklyn Heights is, by this steam ferry right here. I know it's hard to see because the Morse is really what this illustration wants you to look at, but that's not what I want you to look at. This guy. And this guy was actually going back and forth from Grand Street. And I'll tell you why in a second. But let's turn up the years a couple by about a decade, and you'll see there's Corlear's Hook, Lower Manhattan, and this is the Williamsburg shore. It's starting to develop a little more now. Not so much a lot of these freestanding homes, but now you're starting to get a little bit of an inkling of industry development. And there is the Grand Ferry again, pulling into the Grand Ferry dock. I keep pointing that out because we're going to get to that point. Now, Woodhull's main ferry would have come in here. And again, his prospect did not last that long. He didn't do very well financially. And then this is a view of Williamsburg from Corlear's Hook, looking over probably about 15 years after that, the prior illustration. And now you can see you've got more smokestacks going up. You've got denser population. Williamsburg will become its own independent city for a couple of years in 1852. And when it does, it's actually the 20th largest city in America. It will then get assumed into Greater Brooklyn before Greater Brooklyn gets assumed into Greater New York. But here is a depiction of the early Grand Ferry. Now, the second father of Williamsburg, who gets little credit, not like Woodhull gets a lot. The only thing that Woodhull has right now is a hospital named after him. But Thomas Marl, also a real estate developer, decided to go a little bit further south from Woodhull's failed attempt to develop Williamsburg. And he ran his own ferry to the foot of Grand Street, from Grand Street to Grand Street Brooklyn to Grand Street, Manhattan. And his development, he gave a different name. He did not call it Williamsburg, he called it Yorkton. But he was very successful, but his name was not. People hated the name. They actually adopted the name Williamsburg. And Marl himself is the man who split Williamsburg in half by the north and the south side. So the south side of Williamsburg, which is on the other side of Grand Street. So here's Grand Street on this map here. The south side was Marl's Yorkton, and the north side was Woodhull's Williamsburg. And this map is from 1827. So we're talking about 15 years after Woodhull's failure. You get the village of Williamsburg on a whole cut into two parts, north and south side. And here is an old, very old photograph of the Grand Ferry. Again, these ferries, much like the Fulton ferries, were designed not only to carry people, but to carry goods, carriages, horses, oxen, whatever needed to go across the river. Because remember, this is pre-Brooklyn Bridge. We do not, well, actually, I'm not sure if this picture is pre-Brooklyn Bridge, but we do not have any other way to get back and forth from Long Island but ferries. So everybody and the kitchen sink has to be able to cross at this point. Now, what happens is in 1903, this little thing called the Brooklyn Bridge, the Williamsburg Bridge opens. We'll talk about that in a few. And 5 of the devoted ferry lines that service Williamsburg go out of business, including the Grand Ferry. And this is the abandoned site of the Grand Ferry Terminal. And you can see it says ferry to, I believe, I don't know if it says Grand Street or not. I can't see that very well. This is from the Brooklyn Historical Society. But what does this space become, for those of you who don't know the neighborhood, is one of the first vest pocket parks in Williamsburg. For 150 or so years, all of the Williamsburg water line is consumed by industry. And the people who live in the area do not have access to their waterfront. And in 1972, a group of Williamsburgers came together to claim this abandoned ferry landing site as a vest pocket park. For those of you who don't know what a vest pocket park is, it's a park that's sort of claimed by the community. And then eventually in New York, there are vest pocket parks everywhere. Eventually New York, if they see viability in the park, will take it under the wing of Parks and Recreation, which this one was transferred in 1997, by the way. But from 1974 to 1997, it was a community-run space. And this really becomes sort of a place where people in this area of Williamsburg come to rest, enjoy the waterfront. They take graduation photos here, prom photos, wedding photos. This really becomes a spot for all of North Williamsburg because it's the only spot they had for a very long time. And here is this is a more modern shot because you can see over on the right side here, they're starting to build Domino Park, and we'll talk about Domino Park. But one of the really cool things they did in '97 when they rededicated the park under the Parks Department was, and the whole reason why I thought to even do this tour was because of the smokestack. There's a smokestack that was taken from the Pfizer facility. And Pfizer itself was founded by Charles Pfizer, a German immigrant in East Williamsburg. And I think he founds it in 1849. And he starts with antiparasitics there. Citric acid was a big thing that he was experimenting with. But this smokestack was used to melt down molasses for penicillin. And they moved it here as, again, this sort of industrial historical homage to Williamsburg. And it's really, really a neat spot. And right around it, you can't see it too well in this photo, but there are old cobblestones from Grand Street. When they were redoing Grand Street, they exhumed some cobblestones, put it around there. And again, showing the industrial history of the area in this very, very important little park. And here's the plaque that they put at the bottom of the stack itself in 1997, when Parks and Recreation assumes the park into the network. And it talks about how it does burn penicillin for the early experiments with penicillin. Very important, obviously. And of course, the whole idea was tying it to Pfizer because of the vaccine that hopefully Pfizer is providing for us soon for the pandemic. And in volume 2, we'll actually talk about Pfizer's facility, which is not near, it's on the east side of Williamsburg. But here's what we are going to talk about. We're going to talk about Domino, which was known as Havemeyer and Elder for many, many years. This is actually a drawing of the first facility that the Havemeyers built in 1870. Actually, I'm sorry, 1856 was the first facility that they built on the Williamsburg waterfront. Initially, the Havemeyers get started in Lower Manhattan on Van Dam Street. And they come from England. Actually, they're German, but they go to England for a little bit. They're brothers, Frederick and William, and they learn how to refine sugar in London. And then they come in the first wave, the late 1700s. And you have to realize that refining sugar is a very, very complicated, very long-winded process. But when they were doing it, they were basically doing it by pushing it through blankets full of animal blood to sort of separate the sugar from the vegetation, mainly bull's blood, actually. And what you would get is these sort of caked loaves of sugar that were very impure. They had a reddish brownish color. They were not white like we're used to refined sugar today, which of course we know is not good for us. But and sugar at that time was worth almost as much as, you know, certain gems and very high-end goods, because it took so much to refine sugar. The Havemeyers decided to experiment with vacuuming, or using a vacuum process to separate the sugar from the liquid that forms when you burn down the cane and beet plants. And they become so popular, this becomes a very good thing for them because they're mass producing sugar. They move it across the river. And they get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. As a matter of fact, by the end of the Civil War, this facility that you're looking at depicted here are going to have 4,000 workers, and they're going to be producing, get ready for this number, 3 million pounds of sugar a day. That's a day. It's more than half of the sugar consumed in the entire country. Insane. Why the name Elder? Well, one of the Havemeyer daughters actually married into the Elder family, and he comes on as part of the business. Now, of course, they are going to have dominance up until the late 1890s. As a matter of fact, it was so successful that in 1896, American Sugar, which what happens is Havemeyer and Elder start buying up all the other sugar refineries in the area and combining them into one large company called American Sugar. And American Sugar becomes one of the original 12 companies on the Dow Jones Industrial Average. That's how successful they are. Now, the problem is antitrust is going to come along in a couple of years and break up the party. But the Havemeyers were very clever. Also, the Havemeyers suffer a very bad fire in 1882. Before all that, wipes out most of the central refining process buildings right there, as you can see in this depiction, but they are so rich at this point that it didn't take them long, only about 2 years, to rebuild this facility. And of course, this is the facility that we know in part today. And all of what you're looking at in this picture is Domino, Havemeyer / Domino Sugar. All of the piers on the waterfront, all of those boats, all of those buildings are devoted towards refining sugar from the Domino plant. Now, it's called Domino because as they were trying to break up big trusts for the antitrust in the early 20th century, Havemeyer had an idea. One of the Havemeyer sons looked at dominoes and said, oh, dominoes look like the sugar cubes. Let's create another company called Domino, which will be ours. But that's how they got away with keeping a very large part of the business after antitrust was trying to break them up. And that's how you get Domino Sugar that we know so well today. This is what Domino, the back of Domino, what it looked like, again, late 80s, early 90s. That iconic Domino sign was put in 55 or 54. This is what the facility looked like. In 1999, as a matter of fact, 250 workers picketed. They struck because conditions inside this facility were so awful, and they said the wages just weren't cutting it, that they went on strike for 20 months, and it wasn't resolved until February 2001. My dad, who oversees a food production facility in New Jersey, actually hired a couple of guys at that time from Domino and heard some of the horrific stories that were going on inside this production facility, including the size of the rats who like to dine on some of the remains of the raw sugar. I think it was rats the size of dogs, which you can imagine, probably because they were getting very well fed. And then the refinery stops production in 2004 after 148 years on the site. And this is what the abandoned site looked like from the bridge. But of course, that Domino Sugar sign from the 50s was such a staple of the shoreline in New York. And because of that, the center building here, actually the pan, the filter, and the finishing house in 2007 were landmarked. One of those buildings, I believe it was the pan house, which is this front center here, didn't make it. It was structurally not viable enough to survive it, even though it was landmarked, but the filter and finishing house will. Here's another shot. Again, you could just see it sort of becomes a real statement again to that industrial abandonment on the Williamsburg waterfront in the early 2000s. You see the graffiti. And in 2014, it was announced that Two Trees was going to come and develop this area, that they would be destroying everything that wasn't landmarked. And a photographer by the name of Paul Raphaelson goes in and documents sort of the ghostly remains of the refinery. And what you realize about that center finishing house is how densely packed the entire building was with machinery. Look at these network of pipes. He actually published a book in 2017, I believe, called Brooklyn's Sweet Ruin. And these are pictures from that book. See the dust on the floor. Very, very tight industrial area. Now, I want you to take a look at the color of the pillars and some of the machinery here. That color is going to figure into what replaces this site, which is a park, as a lot of you know, which we'll talk about in a second. And it's really interesting how the color of these machines pop, and that was intentional because you see these networks of very gray, dark-looking pipes. You needed to be able to see where some of these indicators and these dials were. Workers needed to get access to them quickly, and painting them that color helped to pop them out. But also, apparently, this color was very cheap. I'll tell you the name in a minute. In 2014, also, the Creative Time and Two Trees, who had just recently purchased this site, brought in artist Kara Walker for a limited engagement to do an art installation inside the raw sugar storage house. And it was called The Marvelous Sugar Baby, but actually I have to read this, sorry, because it's very long. The full name of it is The Marvelous Sugar Baby, in homage to the unpaid and overworked artisans who have refined our sweet tastes from the cane fields to the kitchens of the New World on the occasion of the demolition of the Domino sugar refining plant. That was the full name, but everybody called it The Marvelous Sugar Baby. And it's a sphinx. It's very, very large, and it's a woman, obviously an African American woman, portrayed as a sphinx. There's a lot going on here. Obviously, the exploitation of female workers, the exploitation of African American workers. The little figures around her were called Blackmores. So these little Blackmore children were designed by Walker to be serving this great sphinx. Obviously, you see her breasts, very swollen. It's a hypersexualization of this woman as well. But what is really interesting is that coated on this art piece, it's all made of Domino sugar. Not this, the inside is not Domino sugar, but the outside coating was Domino. And all of Domino actually donated the sugar to coat this sphinx. And it ran, I believe, from May to like July of 2014. And what you can't tell in these pictures is just how A, massive the artwork is, and B, how massive the space is. This house was huge. And here's a long shot of the raw sugar storage facility at Domino, which again, notice the walls. And this is how you know the rats were having a field day. Look at that black residue is from the sugar cane and the sugar beets that were coming in from the south. Up by boat, up the East River, they had docks and piers that would bring this in, and this was the first step in the refining process, was to store it here. Now, I want you to take a look at that center rib, that row of supports, because what's going to happen to it is, it's going to stay right where it is at Domino Park. And Domino Park keeps that there as part of its artifact walk to show you exactly how long the raw sugar house was. And also they built a walkway down the middle, so that it's a really unique sort of experience. And it's exactly where it was, as well as those gantries there, which you will notice are painted that same blue. But before we talk a little bit more about the park, let me talk about the building that remains. So this was the landmarked building, and this is right around when Domino Park opened a couple of years ago. Two Trees commissioned us, much like Wythe, to do tours on the opening day of the park, which was actually quite an honor, because I got to put together the public-facing tours for everybody. And Two Trees gave me a lot of leeway, I have to say, which was nice of them, because I was, I wasn't going to be all that complimentary of some of the things there. One of which is, I think it's a great park, but I think it's a little too overprogrammed for the amount of space that they had. But this center landmarked building is part of the Two Trees development of the entire campus. Now, they've put 4 buildings on there. One of the buildings isn't even built in this photo, but I'll show you another where it is. And the idea was to hollow out the historic finishing house and build a building inside of it, which is going to become, I think, a 385,000 square foot office space. So the idea is, here's a rendering of it. This building is not complete yet, but as you can see, they do plan to restore the iconic sign. They have it in storage on the park site itself. I actually found it behind a fence, so it was part of the tour. You just see like the D on its side and everything else piled up around it. And basically, here's another shot of the inside. You see the window casements and the wall. The idea is to completely gut all of this machinery and turn it into a hollow, what critics say is a ruin, obviously. What Two Trees says, no, technically not, because we're going to support it and we're going to build a building inside it, which will help mitigate the decay of the facade. But some say, maybe, but not really. So inside would be a building inside the building. The space, I have a photo which is coming up of what the space looks like currently now. Very different from what it looked like a couple of years ago when the park opened. But here's the park. And so these are salvaged syrup tanks that were roughly in that area, not exactly there, that were used by Two Trees brought in James Corner Field Operations, who were the same designers who did the High Line. And they came in and for 4 years developed the Domino campus to become this park, which would give, again, the public access to the waterfront. And the gantries were original gantries. They were moved, actually, they were put up higher on sort of these pedestals and incorporated into the artifact walk. And they were painted, here's the name of the paint, I love it. Until We Meet Again was the name. And they actually contacted the paint manufacturer who made that color for the Domino Sugar Refinery for their machinery and got the same paint to keep and maintain that same bright blue color. And the artifact walk included columns from the sugar storage house, the gantries, the cylindrical syrup tanks, which you saw, mooring ballards, bucket elevators, and screws that they put in as sort of like landscape design elements all throughout. All of the lounge chairs and benches and seating were made from recovered wood from the flooring inside the refinery. And James Corner was telling me that they have recovered so much wood from that site that they can replace these seating pieces for about, they calculate 90-ish years. That's how much wood was recovered from the site. The park has 3 parts to it. It has an active and a passive and a meeting area to it. This is the passive area where you can just sit and enjoy. This is the meeting area where, again, with this wood from the reclaimed building, they built sort of this tiered seating area for performances if people wanted to sort of do something or just to sit and meet right in front of what is going to become the office building inside the sugar refinery. Now, this is what the refinery looks like today. They had successfully removed all of the inside of the refinery. And this is a picture of Aaron Assis, our staff photographer. Well, one of our staff photographers. I'm now considering Robin, another one. But you can see it's empty now. And they're holding it up, the facade up with those supports. And right at this very moment, last time I saw it about 2 weeks ago, it's completely wrapped, but nothing, I do not believe construction has begun inside. But this photo is from May because Domino was one of the first parks to do these socially distanced circles, which you see here, 6 feet apart from one another. And the latest was JR's quite awesome installation at Domino Park, which rests on these stacked shipping containers. And it's a mural. This is really quite a feat. Every time you think JR can't kind of like outdo himself, he outdoes himself. This thing is, I think it's like 53-ish feet high. It's gigantic. And of course, it's superimposing the same view you would be looking at with this mural. And it has 1,128 individual New Yorkers in it who were individually photographed and then graphed into this mural. And then again, to make it even cooler, JR has an app. It's called JR Murals. And you can listen to each one of these people talk about their story. Really quite neat. And there it is. Now, to sort of round out the whole thing, last year in December, Two Trees, who has dominance on the waterfront of North Williamsburg. Why? Because this was their first development. You remember the guy flipping the bird? That was to that development. Here's Domino right here with the buildings that they were building behind Domino Park. And this spot will soon become a Two Trees development as well. Those 2 large towers. And there's the little Austin Nichols building right there. the Cass Gilbert, which we were talking about, again, now dwarfed by all of these buildings. But it was announced that Two Trees was going to come in. They were going to get James Cornerfield operations back to create another waterfront park and bridge, beach, sorry, bridge. I know what's coming next. That's why I said bridge. And this is a rendering of what it would look like. And again, the beaches are important not for the novelty of having a beach, according to James Corner, but because they help to mitigate flooding. One of the things they had told me about the park when I was going through and putting the tour of Domino Park together was that the platform, they had to completely build a new platform to put that park where it is. And they made the platform 40 feet larger than the city standard because they went to meet the city 4 days after Hurricane Sandy to talk about building the park. And the city was very squeamish about doing anything because of flooding. And they said, we will make it absolutely, unfloodable. So it's up above the water line and 40 feet out further than it needs to be to mitigate flooding. And this beach is also supposed to help with that as well. You'll see there's also a walkway in the distance that they want to eventually connect Domino to this facility, to the walkway that they have in front of their first development, which rounds its way around the Austin Nichols building. And the idea is to give the public, although the public doesn't love the fact that they're, I'm going to go back for a second, building these large towers, which will throw shade on a lot of the lower buildings behind it. And also, again, do what they will to rents in the area, which are already sky high. But they're saying, yeah, but we're giving you all of this now unfettered waterfront access. These are public parks. Two Trees is maintaining them in cooperation with the Parks Department. And that's what they say is the sort of gift. Now, I taught with, for many years, a woman who was married to a detective in Williamsburg from the late 1970s until I was at his retirement party in, I believe it was 2006. And he said this was an area where, there was a lot of prostitution for the people who were working in the refineries, a lot of drug selling, obviously, right in that immediate area. But he said people would take their cars that they, were just basically relics, and they would just push them off the side of these industrial piers into the East River. And to think now that that's what's being developed there, it always shocks him. I always ask him, I'm like, what do you think of this? And he said, Justin, when I was a detective in this area, people would come out and say, I'll sell you this building on like North 3rd for $1. And he kicks himself that he didn't, because he would be a very rich man today. Last historical point that we will talk about on this tour, before I talk a little bit about the art that sprang up in Williamsburg, is the Williamsburg Bridge. We're not going to do too much with the Williamsburg Bridge, because someday I want to do a bridge series for you guys and spend a lot more time here. But the Williamsburg Bridge was part of the new East River Bridge Authority, which was formed after the Brooklyn Bridge was obviously a wild success in 1883. Another one that we've talked about before is the Queensboro Bridge. And Leffert Buck is the chief engineer, and Henry Hombossel was the architect. And Leffert Buck was very famously a student of Gustave Eiffel. And so there's a lot of allusions to Gustave Eiffel and the tower in Paris, obviously. When the construction began on this in 1898, New York was still New York, and Brooklyn was still Brooklyn, an independent city. But by the time it's finished 7 years later, New York is a greater New York, a 5 unified borough city. This bridge, almost entirely steel, took half the time to build from the Brooklyn Bridge. So 7 years to build, whereas the Brooklyn Bridge took 14, mainly because of the use of steel for the towers, which made it a lot easier to build, but also because Leffert Buck did not galvanize the steel or the wires, which was not a good thing, which we all as New Yorkers paid for in the late 80s. But here you can see some historical photos of them building it. The building and completion of this bridge will forever change Williamsburg. It will bring in a whole new set of immigrants, mainly it was called the Jews Bridge or the Jews Highway. Jews from the Lower East Side came over en masse over this bridge. And of course, it puts those ferry companies out of business. And now Williamsburg is very much connected. And eventually, in 4 years, 1908, will be connected by subway. Little interesting tidbit that in, I believe, 1916, it will also connect Chambers Street in Lower Manhattan under the municipal building to Long Island. LIRR will run service over the Williamsburg Bridge for a couple of years. And here it is in the late 80s. The bridge was in really rough shape. Structurally, it was very, very dangerous. It was in a very dangerous state because of the non-galvanization that Buck neglected to do. It was decided that they needed to basically almost rebuild the bridge in pieces. And that was a 15-year process that went on to rebuild the bridge. It was 15 years and I believe about $1 billion in reconstruction to renovate the bridge itself. Now, there are 4 restroom kiosks on the bridge. Guess who designed those? My guy, my favorite, Guastavino. No public access, unfortunately, and I cannot find a picture. So if anybody has one, please, please, please send it along. I'm dying to see the ceilings inside of there. And we'll round off the tour. I know we're going, you know, it's 1:15. Can't imagine if I had done the full thing. So what happens is in the late 80s, as industry starts moving out and Williamsburg begins to depress, art students are finding in some of these abandoned industrial spaces the means to live cheaply and do their art without having to bother with anybody. And this is actually a picture from 1993 of an early arts collective in the abandoned warehouses on the north side, putting together these installations. I always think of Aaron because Aaron loves to do string installations. This is a string installation that was going up. And here is an installation performance in front of a group of unused TVs. And of course, performance art, installation art, all of which were getting incubated in these abandoned, very cheap spaces. Now for music, this is what's going to really put Williamsburg on a global map. And the birth of music in Williamsburg really begins at this space, which is on North 6th Street, which is now called the Hall of Music in Williamsburg. It's now run by Bowery Presents, a very large entertainment conglomerate. But it first started as sort of this extremely indie space for a lot of bands that got their start in Williamsburg. And actually, Electroclash is a whole subgenre of music which was born in Williamsburg in the early 2000s. And the scene really blows up. And this is what creates a whole new culture of artist and musician. That's actually Beirut. I actually saw them at the Hall of Music. At the time, it was still North 6. That was its original name. It creates this whole genre known as the hipster. You may have heard of it before. The hipster had a very long run. We think the hipster is finally gone, but we're not sure. Some people say they're still around. Millennial has now sort of become the name, but just to give you an idea, and I don't know if there are any big music buffs here on the talk, but LCD Sound System, which is now fairly famous, they got their start in Williamsburg. TV on the Radio, the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, Fiery Furnaces, Animal Collective, and The National. A lot of people I was listening to in the early aughts all got their start here and then found fame. And of course, it's this act that makes Brooklyn a global brand. Williamsburg turns Brooklyn into a brand where if you went around the world, and I have, and you talk to somebody and you say, where are you from? I usually say New York City. And they're like, oh, cool. It's pretty credible. Then I started saying Brooklyn about 10 years ago, and they'd go, oh, what's it like to live in Brooklyn? And what they're thinking is, what is it like to live in Williamsburg? And it's like, nah, I don't live in Williamsburg. I live in Windsor Terrace. And everybody's like, less interesting. But Williamsburg really becomes what Brooklyn is for the rest of the world when they turned Brooklyn into a brand. And here, I love this illustration. This is what a Williamsburg hipster man would have looked like in 2008. And you would definitely see a lot of these characters walking the streets on Bedford Avenue, on Berry, Metropolitan, wearing their Vans, having their vintage cameras, their skinny jeans, their flannels. And there was a great website blog, which they took down a couple of years ago was called Halloween or Hipster. And it was, you couldn't tell the difference between whether it was a Halloween costume or a Williamsburg hipster. And of course, what comes with that, what begins as graffiti, which is just part of the urban landscape and has been for decades, then becomes street art. And North 6th Street in Williamsburg is really the spot where most of the famous street artists of the world come to tag. And so this was Banksy. And we knew we had arrived when Banksy comes, and Banksy has a work on North 6th Street. It was this one. And for those of you who don't know Banksy, Banksy is an anonymous street artist from Bristol, England, who is still anonymous. Great movie, Exit Through the Gift Shop, if you're interested in learning more about Banksy. But Banksy also had a bunch of other compatriots who we do know of. Here's one. This is Nick Walker. This is also on North 6th Street. These are gone now, by the way. These were historic street art. They are no longer there. And he has a series called The Vandal. And The Vandal is this guy in a bowler hat. And he tags all over the world with this particular gentleman. But here, this showed up, I believe, in 2007-ish. And what was very interesting about this was the fact that his face is covered, but his eyes are peering out, because he wasn't, again, it was sort of a commentary as what's going on here in Williamsburg. The rapid shift from an industrial depressed neighborhood to a highly gentrified neighborhood. And then what we have later on, which is still around, is commissioned street art murals, which are all over this area of Williamsburg. And this is by Brazilian artist Cobra, who was commissioned to do this piece. And this is Elvis Presley with on his helmet, "War is Hell." And this location, actually, if you want to take a look at it, is 218 Bedford Avenue, which is the corner of North 5th and Bedford, but it's heavily tagged. It's in bad shape, and nobody knows if it's going to be replaced or if they're going to repair it, but a lot of the, I guess, neighborhood artists are reaching out now against this mural art. But this is probably one of the most famous, and that is a depiction of Basquiat and Warhol. And this was taken from a photograph, which was taken by Michael Halsband, a legendary photograph in the 80s of both of these as boxers. And this is at Bedford Avenue and 9th Street, also done by Brazilian artist Cobra as well. Now, as an allusion to end up, we're back at the Wythe, because this was a loop tour, by the way. They commissioned me to start and end at the Wythe, which is why it took 3 hours. But you'll see that hotel sign going up where the stairway used to be. That hotel sign was done by artist Tom Fruin. Now, you probably recognize Tom Fruin's work because it's those multi-patchwork glass water towers. There's one down in Brooklyn Heights by Brooklyn Bridge Park. There's a couple in Williamsburg. It's making me dizzy, sorry. But on, well, we got to go back 1 second. It was made from salvaged store signs that were taken off of old Williamsburg businesses and discarded. And on some of them is the graffiti work of this artist, who's Dan Witz. And Dan Witz is a really brilliant artist from Chicago, also a RISD grad, went to Cooper Union as well. And his graffiti is so realistic. This is actually a painting, it's not graffiti. I have a picture of a little bit of his graffiti that it was rumored, Peter Lawrence told me, that the cops would actually watch him do the graffiti before they would fine him or arrest him because it was so beautiful. And here is a little example of a Dan Witz on a lamp on Metropolitan. And again, it's really hard to tell whether it's real or whether it's illustrated. That is just how realistic his work is. And he's still an active artist today. He has a lot of gallery showings, and he's less into street art. Like most of the artists I have been presenting here, most of them now are on a much bigger scene. And I will end the last one with my favorite, which is the Mona Lisa of Brooklyn. Really, really sweet story. This is at Broadway and Bedford, obviously right at the base of the Williamsburg Bridge. And this was the result of a contest winner, Stephen Paul at the time. He was 17 years old, and he entered into a scholastic artists contest. And out of 255,000 entries, he won with his photograph of a good friend of his and classmate. He went to Edward R. Murrow High School in Midwood, Brooklyn. And this is, now I'm blanking on her name. Nina, her name is Nina Adel. And his photograph won, and Colossal Media, which I didn't even talk about, I'll talk about on volume 2, Colossal Media took it and turned it into this huge mural, which is really a showstopper in the heart of Williamsburg. And it was dubbed not by him, it's actually the name of the photograph is Lost Time. But I believe it was CBS News who interviewed this Stephen Paul, and they called it, it's sort of like the Mona Lisa of Williamsburg, and thus the name stuck. And it's really just really stunning. I really like it. And that's how I'm going to end this tour, with this photo of Williamsburg, the city, because there are so many things we did not talk about, including the iconic Williamsburg Savings Bank, this building over here, which really starts an artist incubator here, is one of the first buildings to be landmarks in Williamsburg. And of course, Peter Luger's. We didn't even talk about Peter Luger's, but it's 1:25, so I'm done. Now let's see what you have to say. I apologize. Oh, homeless or hipster. I forgot about homeless or hipster, Diana. That's also a good one. I love it. All right, let me go back to the hellos. And again, if you have questions, just put them in. I'm alone today, so I didn't have anybody helping me moderate. Yes, Elliot, I will send the Duke Riley piece and the Duke Riley piece. I'll send you the page, and the page also has the key on it so that you can decipher it. It's really quite cool. Yeah, Grand Central Eagle. Very good, Mark. The Heckler Company also did do the steelwork for Grand Central Station, by the way, not the terminal and not the depot. So that 4-year period where Grand Central was a station, William Wilgus actually commissioned Heckler to do all of the ironwork for that iteration. The Eagle, yeah. So everybody's picking up on the Eagle. Audrey Munson Astor Place. Jeffrey, what is that in reference to? I don't remember. Oh, Bill. Oh, good. I'm glad you made it, Bill. Charles Pratt also invented the non-explosive kerosene. Yes, that very, very true. Yeah, the Brooklyn Inlet. I actually, if you guys are local and have a chance to, before they start developing, although I think you've got plenty of time, it is actually really neat to see this last piece of industrial wilderness down by the Bayside Oil and Brooklyn Inlet. It's sort of the, the last natural nub of the inlet in its natural state. And yes, it's sort of fenced up a bit, but you can peer through the fence. And I love spurious sugar. Yeah, one of the great things, Pete, about the Austin Nichols building, the Cass Gilbert building, is even amongst being swallowed by those very large buildings, it still stands out very stately as sort of the granddaddy of the buildings in that neighborhood. And it's just really beautiful to look at. It's, I think, because of the way the white is so white, it gleams, and that, again, I think I've said this, the Egyptian Renaissance quality to it. It's just stunning. It's a great building. And I realized that Guy Eric, who loved living there, he just became obsessed with it. I would too if I lived there. Thank you, Morbo, for outstanding tour. This, I think, might be one of my longest. I think this is the one with the most slides. I think World's Fair is a close second. Yeah, we'll do part 2 in January. There's so much more we haven't covered. Serpico, oh, all these great things. Thank you, Joe. Hipster or Hasid? Jimmy Kimmel. I didn't do any video. I usually throw in a video or two. I decided this one we weren't going to do any video, but Hipster or Hasid's always a good one. Yeah, thanks, Kevin. My motto has always been to leave people wanting more even after 90 minutes. Oh, thank you very much, Kevin. Kevin, I just finished Enchanted New York, and I am dying to do some of those walks. So thank you. Thank you, Klaus. Oh, yes, Jeffrey Bernard, inside of Hecla Plant. Yes, Astor Place. Yeah, so Astor Place is a reproduction, but it was a very good one. Joe Holmes had a good dinner at the Wythe. Yes. So there are two restaurants at the Wythe. There's one upstairs at the top, the addition that Morris designed. I think it's 5 floors. And then the one in the right off of the lobby is really good. That's the one I've eaten at. Really great. Oh, thank you, Bill. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if there are no other questions, I am going to down a gallon of water because my throat is really dry. And I will see you all very, very soon. I will schedule part 2 for probably mid-January. And again, part 2 will talk about sort of city center of Williamsburg when Williamsburg was a city. Williamsburg also had its own currency for a couple of years, by the way. Very interesting. And we'll talk about the east leg of the tour, heading back up to the Wythe and more about Williamsburg. Yeah, downstairs too. Very good. I highly recommend it. The Wythe Hotel. Also, I'm not saying this because they had commissioned us. I haven't done a tour for them in 2 years. We sort of went on to develop other stuff and with the business, but really, really, it's expensive, but it's a really great place if you know anybody who is looking to stay somewhere, or if you're from out of town and looking to come to New York at some point. Very, very nice staff. Really interesting building, and that restaurant is really quite good. So very, very highly recommended. And if you see the owner, you tell him Justin says hi. Peter and I became good friends through this initiative. All right, everybody, have a very good day. We are done with programming for the week. Next Tuesday, we are doing Peggy Gavin's Christmas Tales, Animal Tales from Old New York. I will unfortunately not be moderating that one, but fortunately you will see Michelle. I'm going to be giving a Grand Central in-person tour that morning. And then Wednesday, I believe for all of the new insiders we have coming in, we are doing something called our best sellers. So if you see repeats of Penn Station, World's Fair, Subway, we're doing those, or I'm doing those because they're our best attended, and for all the new insiders coming in, because of Black Friday, give them a chance to see them live. And that's all I can remember, but I think that's enough. So have a very good weekend. Stay safe. Thank you for joining me. Always a pleasure. Have a really great day, guys. Bye.